Hello, everybody. This is Trip, and I'm here with the one and only good Dr. Jorg Rieger. And this is the first session of Capital Change. Why? Well, religion and economics, as usual, overrated. We all know we're screwed, but now we might admit it. That's what we're going to be doing tonight. But before we jump in, I want to let Jorg tell you a little bit about himself and exactly what had to happen for me to talk him into doing this class.
That's a big question. What had to happen? I mean, many things. Whenever Trip asks me to do something, I better do it because I really believe that he knows what he's doing and he cares. That's the main thing. People that care and that really have a passion for the work. For me, I'm a theologian, so talking about economics may be a little bit of a strange thing to do, but the reality is, I feel I have to do it because these are things that nowadays decide life and death, not only for people, but also for the planet. And theology is a matter of life and death. And so theologians cannot simply weasel out, even though I know it makes us uncomfortable. I know some of these things cannot easily be discussed in polite company, whether that's the family dinner table or, the church or the academic classroom where I spend a lot of my time. These things usually raise eyebrows, but I am really looking forward to this. And I think this will be a good event. Thanks to all of you for joining us and for raising good questions.
Yeah, so, before we jump in and stuff to this night, I want to say a little bit about just the class in general. A couple of things, between the different places this is streaming, there's 150, so are you, in different places currently, but there's just under 1,000 that have already signed up. And then tomorrow I'm going to use an edited version of this, release it on the podcast, and then another 30 or 40,000 people will hear about it, and hopefully we'll lure some of them over to this experience. So that means one of the coolest parts is you can participate at whatever the convenient and optimal level is where you are now. If you just want to listen in and download the audio and listen or watch the videos and not be in a group and not be on your Facebook feed like some ministers asked if that was possible, totally okay. If you're in the group and have spent years helping to organize labor and want to answer questions and engage with ministers that are just now starting to raise and ask these questions, that's awesome. If you're a student and all of a sudden there are people that have cared about, organizing and class analysis, and you get to connect with people and now you have new friends and you learn what it's like on the ground, that's great. If you have a family member, a close friend who thinks this class is a good idea and you aren't sure, but you love Jesus and want to take it seriously, you're welcome. So our goal is to honor people wherever they are, their questions, their concerns, their pushbacks, their ideas, but also the essential part of this class is to honor the lived experience of people on the underside and try to take that seriously because that's at the heart of biblical religion. And so that's why the hooking together the religion and the economic is important. And I think Jorg and I, this both matters to us as theologians of the church and as neighbors to all the people we live next to. But the other thing I thought that might be important to say at the beginning would be kind of when both of us as theologians of the church recognized that the economic question shouldn't be an elective, but at the heart of doing theology today. So, I mean, is there a particular moment in your own, uh, you know, vocational journey where you realized that dodging economics as a theologian means dodging an essential part of how you've come to understand the faith?
Yes, for sure. I mean, in my own case, as a theologian, I grew up in Germany as a Methodist, went to seminary, good Methodist and all, where the first liberative theology I encountered was feminist theology. And observing what was happening to women all around me really made me a believer because I could see things at that point, and it really shook me up. Coming to the U.S., the race question, of course, became one of the big ones. I mean, I never left the feminist question either, but the race question really shook me up. I was a PhD student at Duke in Durham, North Carolina, in the early 1990s. This is the Deep South, right? You know what it's like, Trip. And so from there on, my work developed. The next big steps is I wrote a couple of books on empire and globalization. And the more I talked and thought about it, I realized, this post-colonial empire, after the end of official colonialisms and all of that, is really in many ways driven by economics. It's driven certainly by politics, by power, but it's big money that drives a lot of it. And so I sort of started investigating that more and more. And then I realized, it's not just the post-colonial empire, it's also the church and the academy and our family lives and our sort of innermost beings that are all shaped by these economic relationships. And then I was surprised that nobody was talking about it. So for me, it was a process to get to that point. And then when I started talking about it, sometimes all hell broke loose because people didn't want to talk about it or were resistant to it. Others really said, well, finally, somebody, and it's like what Jesus is saying, he's come to bring that sword to separate a few things that had to be separated. But really, the end result was, you built much broader relationships, friendships, families, and communities. So for me, getting a foot in the labor movement, reclaiming my own traditions. My parents were postal workers in Germany, and they were both members of the Postal Workers Union. We didn't think much about it back then. I realized why that was really important, them being both Methodists and postal workers organized in the union. And all of that sort of gradually came to bear. And so it was a long journey. But every day I realize there is more I have to learn. And that's what we're doing here together.
Yeah, that's great. And briefly, I'm sure I'm a minister, so I can't not tell stories when things come up. So I'm sure plenty of personal things will come up over the 6 times. But um, it was my summer of my sophomore year in college. I worked construction for a construction company a family at church owned, and because I got paid more per hour, which meant I could save money to go to more concerts on weekends during the school year. This was the logic.
And that's important. Yes. Yeah.
And I realized that I was getting paid more than everyone because I was the preacher's kid, or the same as the very gifted people, doing about 1/4 of the work. And that just seemed wrong innately. And that was my like Paul Tillich phase. 18 to 19, I basically read everything that was in English. And that summer, I read Socialist Decision by Paul Tillich while I was working construction at lunches. And then later that summer, I was reading sermons of Karl Barth, and he has a sermon about that God takes sides. And it was that kind of like moment of realizing that I was getting paid $20 an hour to be a mediocre construction worker who probably should have not been doing it, except that he wanted to have expendable income while he's in college, right? And then I'm like, God takes sides with Karl Barth. Read Paul Tillich's The Socialist Decision, and was like, I can't not take this seriously. And so, like, since then, it's been on the docket. And I think that where this class came from is, the request for this class for Homebrewed Christianity, the podcast I run, if you're new to this, the members and people have been in reading groups over the last year. We did one going through Process and Reality by Alfred North Whitehead with John Cobb, which is amazing. Jeffrey Pugh, who's on here, and we did one on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We did one with Adam Clark on Black theology, particularly James Cone. Diana Butler Bass and I did one over during the election. And so anyway, I've been doing these, and one of the refrains that keeps coming up is, I really would like significant time thinking about religion and economic critique, where it's not just assumed, because a lot of religious scholars just assume a conversation that we don't have in our churches because right? Who were the people asking? A lot of ministers and leaders that go, I agree with you. I read that book by Tillich, but how do you introduce this? And how do you think about it when the economic question is taboo? And then how do you bring it up when you're insecure because you're not an economist? And you see how it goes out. So hopefully, one of my goals for this class is, one, I get to learn from Jorg, and we all get to interact together and figure out what are the language and questions that help facilitate a fruitful conversation for people in communities of faith and then in online spaces to connect these dots. So yeah, that's
And the time really has come for that, Trip. I'm really glad
yes.
that you're doing it and that you're doing it now, because we cannot keep on keeping on the way we've been doing it. I mean, let me add one story of my own here also. Coming from Germany, I had finished my MDiv, my Master's of Divinity at a German Methodist seminary. Then I went on to do my PhD at Duke, and I could not believe what American capitalism looked like, because we had capitalism in Europe, right? I grew up under capitalism in Western Germany, but we also had healthcare, we had dental care, we went to university for free. That was all part of capitalism. That was not socialism. Don't let people tell you that's socialism. No, this is all a sort of socially responsible capitalism, and it doesn't take a whole lot to do these things. But the first year I was a student at Duke, we lived in an apartment complex. There was a taxi driver that lived across from us, who needed his appendix removed. Uh, and my goodness, it almost bankrupted him. I thought, what is this? If I have a problem, had a problem back in Germany, I go to the doctor and don't think anything of it. And here you can, and then, you look at, some of the same companies. I mean, look at VW. If you're a VW worker in Germany, you have a very different deal and a very different life than if you're a VW worker here in Chattanooga in Tennessee, just south of where I am, and so on and so forth. So for me, coming to the US already 30 years ago was a major shock, and things have gotten worse since then. So we have a lot to talk about, but the great thing is there's also a lot of really cool stories of how things are changing, and things that I'm seeing. So I'm not talking about this frustrated or disappointed. I'm talking about look at all the cool things that are happening.
Yeah. When you mentioned the taxi driver, in your I can't remember which reading it is right now, but one of them talks about just the difference between the United States and the rest of the West when it goes to even like
Yeah.
general support a capitalist economy gives. Moving to Scotland for the last year and a half after being in the United States, it's nuts. Like, it just makes America look like it just hates poor people, and it's depressing. It's the idea that we think we're doing good. Like, I bet it would be like the top 20% of America, like, probably does better than the top 20% or something. But if you're in that bottom 80, like, you'd much rather be in the UK, and they've been having a conservative government here they all complain about. My neighbors, both taxi drivers, own a home that's like 280,000 pounds if you want to buy it. Their kids went to free to the University of Edinburgh, not a shabby school, even though they let me hang out there. And they all have health care. They don't have the anxiety I have about lots of things. Like, just talking to them, what would you be doing if you were a couple that were both taxi drivers in the United States? You'd have your Uber app on all the time, and you would not own a home. Your kids would not go to one of the best universities in Europe, and you would not know that if something horrible happened, like the appendix story, that there's support structure. So, like, the conversation is different, right, in different parts of the world. But I think America is so smitten with the naturalizing the story it tells itself, right? Like, about the economy. This is how it works, and this is just how it is. That, moving here, even someone that was already down for being rather progressive politically, you just like see it working. You're like, well, maybe this is why it's hard to get a visa to go to other countries. Because if you just visit these countries, you're just like, so you're both taxi drivers and you own a home? Yeah. Well, have you paid it off? Oh, we did that 3 years ago. Yeah, but you're only 50. anyway, so I mean, that's just an example that like when you move to another place, it just dramatically shifts. So anyway, it popped
And
up.
what's important here is we're not just talking about dream worlds or great ideas or wishful thinking. We're talking about stuff that's happening elsewhere. We're talking about stuff that works, and we're talking about stuff that is coming along sort
Mhm.
of through the pipelines that people don't even see yet. So there's a lot of education that has to happen in that regard as well.
So what we're going to do, York's going to kick things off with a mini lecture of sorts. He even has high quality slides, so you should tell him thank you. Um, and then he and I'll talk about the content of it. Then we'll open up to the reading. Some of you sent questions, which I've already compiled on things, and York and I are planning on talking about it. But during this lecture and during, if you have questions around the reading and such, feel free to put them in, and I'll edit it in all the topics we're doing. Also, remember, you can always respond to any email that comes throughout the class, and you'll get, and I'll add it to our next conversation time. So with that, I will let Jorg take it away so he can share his screen so you can see his slides. And having seen a lot of theologian slides recently in a year of Zoom, yours are significantly more aesthetically pleasing than the average systematic theologian. I was a little bit depressed you didn't have any 90s clip art in here, York. So
Well, that's what you can supply.
all right.
That would be great. I wouldn't mind that at all. Yeah, I mean, I'm not an artist. One of my daughters is, but that's a different story. But I like to at least, look at things. And so I got these slides so people won't have just to look at me talking, but sort of look at the slides, follow along, see what you think. And I really look forward to the conversation. But sometimes you have to front load the conversation a bit. And so that's what I'm doing now, putting out a few ideas, maybe by way of introduction, just to let you know, this is not to brag, to show you all my books that I've ever written, but here four that deal with the topic that we're talking about. And the first one, that's the No Rising Tide one. This one was written during the Great Recession and published in 2009. That sort of got the whole cycle started for me to investigate the thing a little more closely. At that point, we assumed that people would wake up, and finally, not only rebel but build alternatives. The way it happened after the Great Depression, that didn't happen at the time, but maybe this is the time now. So we're going back and reclaiming some of what we learned in those years. The second one here is, I think, one of the very few books that talks about class, or used to talk about class in 2013, Religion, Theology, and Class. Because those are issues, I challenge you, anyone on this conversation, to show me where these issues are happening, where these discussions are happening in theology and in religious studies, because it's really not. And so we got that started with an edited volume that has great contributions from people around the world, as well as in the US. And we're always doing this work intersectionally. So we're talking about class and race, class and gender, class and sexuality, you name it, class and globalization. So this is not a unilinear thing, but it's really building that broader conversation. That next one, Unified Real Force, is co-edited with my partner, Rosemary Henkel-Rieger, co-authored actually, because we realized that talking about class is great, but you really need to talk about what class does. And when you talk about agency, you have to talk about working people. And we talked about the working majority, which is not just people working for minimum wages or white men in factories, but really everybody in the 99%, which is defined as people that have to work for a living. Plus, we're really saying that faith and labor can overcome America's inequalities. There's a plural here that's talking not just about economics, money, and power. It's also talking about race again, gender, sexuality, and so on. We'll have more time in the course to talk about this. And the last one, this is hot off the press, that's co-edited with my colleague Jin Young Choi, who teaches New Testament at Colgate Rochester Divinity School. And this came out of an international meeting that we had in Taiwan right before COVID, when we could still travel. And you actually got to read Jin Young's contribution for today. So this is just a little bit about my own academic work. There's a lot more, but you can always look me up on the Vanderbilt website and look at my CV. Here, I just want to make sure you get the idea that I'm not just a talking head or talking about ideas. Those are some of my affiliations. So I see myself really as an organic intellectual. I'm directing the Zwendlin Cook program in religion and justice, which, as far as I know, is the only program in the US, anyways, bringing religion and labor issues together, not just economic, but labor. And then the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development, you'll hear more about that. And then the various AFL-CIO organizations as well. Okay, so what I would like to do now is in this, after having introduced myself just briefly, talk a little bit about what's happening here. You know, in this title, we know we're getting screwed. I think we know we're getting screwed, but we also have to put out a few ideas and a few numbers. That's what I want to do first, so that we're on the same page. And I think these are things that you're already familiar with, but not everybody in the same way. And so this is to create some common ground for our discussion, and also to show that things are really pretty serious. Here's a question I sometimes raise, and I know you can't answer it now directly, but let me put it to you anyway. When you think about inequality, was inequality greater in the past, or is it greater in the present? And, you know, for comparison's sake, I oftentimes use numbers I found from the Roman Empire in the year 150 Common Era. This is about 100 years after Jesus was crucified. And then you look at the United States. And the way people answer is really usually very interesting, because we're conditioned to think, well, things may not be great now, but they surely were worse in the past. Here's the number I found from the Roman Empire, 150 CE. The top 1% is controlling about 16% of all wealth. And I know these things are hard to figure out, and people can ask questions. What exactly do you know? How do you know it? But this is a number that at least gets us started, right? 1%, top 1% controls 16% of all wealth. What if it's 20%? Okay. Well, here is the United States today, 27. Well, actually not today. This is 2017. The top 1% controls 40% of all wealth. I wasn't able to find anything post 2017. If anybody has these numbers, send them to Tripp or to myself. I'd love to see them. I've seen estimates, people saying we will be at the top 1% controlling 70% of all wealth soon. But those were estimates, and I don't know where we are. It's certainly higher now. The 1% controls more than 40% of all wealth in the United States today, which makes us certainly more unequal than even the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was an empire, right? Whatever we are, we can discuss. So inequality is actually getting worse. And you probably know this also. These are the Gini coefficient numbers for some of the G7, the G7, the big economic players. And here you see that the US is actually way ahead of everybody in terms of inequality. We're really winning the inequality game, because we're the most unequal of the G7. And if you compare that with many developing countries, it's a real awakening, because we're a lot more unequal than even many developing countries that you could think of. I'll give you a few more slides here. And those you may have seen, but they tell the story in a little different way, because here we're talking not so much about the top, we're talking about what's happening to the rest of us. Here you have a graph that pulls together productivity and wages from 1948 to 1973. This is the United States, and here you see that productivity and wages rose together. In some ways, you can say employers and working people both benefited. This is U.S. capitalism up to a certain point. And I don't want to paint a rosy picture here saying everything was great, because we know for a fact that a lot of people were not benefiting in those days either. Domestic workers were left out by most of the New Deal protections. This is when the New Deal this is the effects of the New Deal, right? And of course, domestic workers were primarily women of color. They didn't benefit from this. Agricultural workers were excluded from this. Tipped workers weren't covered by the minimum wage, and 70% of tipped workers were women. Black workers in the South continued to live under legal segregation in these years. In the North, employers paid Black workers less and excluded them from some jobs. This is still happening today. White workers in the South were earning less than white workers in the North, but also less than Black workers in the North. Keep those things in the back of your mind. Race plays an important role in a lot of what we're talking about. In the Southeast, Latino migrant workers were not benefiting from this either. LGBTQIA people were not really protected legally. And even with the GI Bill, many people of color were still excluded from higher education. So even though you have something happening that's good in those years, there's still a lot of problems. But these are the people. This is my slide of people that were not benefiting from that deal even. But then something happens in the 70s, and here you see how all of a sudden productivity keeps rising, but hourly compensation is not keeping up with it. And that's significant because this really marks a change in the economy. This is sort of the early beginnings of what we now call neoliberal capitalism, where you have some interesting developments. On the one hand, you have deregulation. Big businesses are deregulated. There's less and less whatever regulations there are for businesses, including, of course, tax liabilities, including sort of other legal restraints, the way you have to do your business, and so on. That gets more and more liberalized. At the same time, of course, that liberation, that deregulation is not true for working people. In fact, the unions get more and more restricted. So while businesses get deregulated, unions and people's organizations basically have their hands tied. And so somehow that does something to move these two graphs apart from each other. Privatization moves along, is humming, wages are kept low. And today we have the same problem. Right now, we finally talk about workers as essential. We hadn't realized for a while that they're actually essential workers, that the country is not run and built by CEOs alone. Like Rome wasn't built by Caesar either, right? You remember this, right? Caesar didn't actually do the constructing work. And so we're now realizing we have essential workers without which we could not survive. But that doesn't do anything, as far as I can tell, quite yet, to bring people's wages up against. So this is a question about the value of work, the value of working people, and how basically we value people's production. So keep that in mind as a theme for the whole course. The question is not merely distribution, who has what, and redistribution, how do we maybe distribute more fairly, but how do we value production? How do we value people's agency? How do we value the work of essential workers? Those kinds of questions are really crucial. And then one more slide, and these are all things that we come back to eventually. 2 examples. You may have seen these numbers, but let them sink in for a while here. Wealth inequality in America. The US billionaires gained $1.3 billion during about the last year when the COVID-19 crisis officially started. And in that same moment, you also have the sources here. NPR reports that 29.5% of US families are food insecure. That's a euphemism, right? Food insecure sounds better than starving, or going to bed hungry, or not being able to have enough food for their children. But that's what we're facing. About a third of American families do not have enough food for their children at a time when some people are doing extremely well. And we somehow have to account for that. Those are the sort of questions that are before us. You knew it, but here you have it in a very small compass. One more thing here I want to put out there. It's clear that more and more people are not really benefiting anymore from this economy, and that's true not just globally, but also for people in the US. And it's possible that you're all doing okay at the moment, people on this webinar, but I guarantee you, you know people who are not. And that could include your children, that could include your parents, other close relatives, people in your communities, people in your faith communities. You know them. And you also know that the problem is not that they're lazy or that they have done anything wrong. It's just that the system is not working for them. And if you had to ask the question for them or for yourself, that's always asked at job interviews, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Let's be really honest. Where do you see them in 5 years? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I think we're beginning to realize that when I talk about no rising tide, I know that the economy goes in cycles. I know that the COVID economy has been booming. We're at a Dow above 30 whatever thousand points now. But I also know that it's not rising anymore for more and more people. And that's what we'll have to talk about, because these are, whether if it's not you, it is somebody you know, and it's many people in our communities. And therefore, it's not just somebody else's problem. So why do we keep going despite things being like that? I want to put 3 responses out there. First one is this: economics has become a religion. Now that sounds a little maybe big words, big ideas, but I'm not making this up. This is a conversation that has happened in the field of economics itself. There's a book that kicked this off published about 20 years ago by Robert Nelson, who wrote this book titled Economics as Religion. And what Nelson is saying in the early 2000s is basically that the task of the top economists, the people sort of in the State Department, the people in the corporations, the people that are supposed to hold it all together, their task is not analyzing the economy, but keeping the big ideas before the people. The task of top economists is keeping the big ideas before people. Basically, like preachers exhorting people to keep the faith in ideas, like the following. I'll give you a couple of examples. First one is the American dream. What is it? Well, work hard and you'll succeed, or pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And as far as I can tell, that's really a great idea. It's a wonderful belief to have. But when's the last time somebody has really checked that? Of course, some people are checking it, but that's not the top economist's job, according to Robert Nelson, who's an economist himself. So here, keep the great ideas before people without really asking questions about them. A couple of more examples. A rising tide will lift all boats. That's a saying that goes back to President Kennedy, put it out there early 60s at the dedication of a dam in Arkansas. A rising tide will lift all boats. The assumption is if the economy is doing better, everybody's doing better. Well, we've seen the rising tide, right? Billionaires in America added 1.3 billion. It's not lifted all boats, right? In fact, it sunk a lot of people, and you know it. I don't have to tell you that. Other ideas, wealth always trickles down. That's the belief, but have we seen it? Related to that idea is that jobs and welfare is created by the elites. This is why we have tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy, that jobs are created because, the wealthy sort of get a better deal. We haven't really seen that either. Another one, these are all the big beliefs, religion as economics as religion. Profits are most effectively privatized. That's what they started to tell us, really, when Margaret Thatcher became prime minister in England and Ronald Reagan, the president in the US in the late 70s, early 80s, that profits are best with private investors, and that guarantees efficiency and effectiveness and all of that. And in that regard, that CEOs are responsible to private shareholder interest, right? These are all the stories that we're told. Even though, this is now somewhat questioned a bit, and people say, well, maybe we need to have interests a little bit more broadly, not just shareholders, but also stakeholders. But the reality is it should be in private hands. Nobody else should have anything to say about that. And while profits should be privatized, losses should be socialized. These are all the big beliefs, economics as religion. If a company is too big to fail, they shouldn't take the risk of being a company. We should bail them out. We should make sure that they do not fail. Again, we've seen that, and we keep seeing that. So those are some of the big ideas that economists are holding before us. And if they're big ideas that function like a religion, all of a sudden theologians have a role to play. So maybe me as a theologian, I should talk about this if it functions like a religion, because we have some critical tools for thinking critically about religion. Religion is not always a bad thing, but in this case, you can see it's not always working either. So here's economics as religion, but this is the way we oftentimes think about religion as religion too. That's sort of the other problem. Namely, religion oftentimes means you have a couple of great ideas that you have to accept without questioning. So there are big ideas about God and Jesus and the world, which we're supposed to believe without ever testing. You know what I'm talking about, right? Ideas like God helps those who help themselves. We're supposed to believe that, but test it, and maybe it doesn't work so well, right? Or ideas like God will never fail us. That's a wonderful belief to have until something happens to you, right? The problem is things happen to people all the time. Maybe it hasn't happened to you yet. It might still, maybe it won't. But if something happens to others, that might raise a question about your big belief about God. Because once it happens to you, you surely will ask that question. This understanding of religion is a problematic one. I don't think that's a good definition, but this is what we're talking now. Economics as blind faith, religion as blind faith. It's not really helping us either. In fact, in this understanding of religion, faith is stronger the more incredible beliefs you can have at the same time. The more miracles, the better, especially if they upset the natural status quo. Not the social status quo, of course. We don't want miracles upsetting the social status quo, but the natural status quo is okay. Again, more blind faith, belief stuff that ultimately you can't test. So here, dominant economic issues come into religion in a way that we also have to watch out for. You all have heard about the gospel of prosperity. Well, we know it, right? The gospel of prosperity, rich people are rich because, God bless them. And you can be rich too if you do certain things that God wants you to do. Well, that too hasn't worked, right? Except for a few, maybe the preachers themselves, prosperity preachers that have their private jets. But it doesn't really ever lift the masses out of poverty. I haven't seen it yet. You could show it to me if that's happening. But it's this blind faith, that things will happen, good things will happen if you do certain things. And it's not happening. That's what we're seeing. Unfortunately, the main line is not that different from the gospel of prosperity, because if you look at the operative theological images, we too look up into the sky when we talk about God in the main line, right? God somehow like a king, or a ruler or a master. perhaps a CEO, or a very powerful politician, always up. And then the idea is, that whatever is up there will trickle down to us, or maybe, some miracle will come and will lift us higher. This is blind faith. And what I'm arguing here is that economic and religious blind faith are connected. And oftentimes, even sort of well-meaning efforts at reconstructing this blind faith fail us. So we need to do some real hard-nosed theological work, and we'll get to that in a minute. So my point here, this is my first point. Why do we keep going? Economics as religion and religion as religion haven't helped us. So we need to rethink economics and religion in terms of what's happening in real life. Second point, for that, you don't have to be an economist or a theologian. You just look at what's happening in real life, what's happening to you and your community, and you start thinking and arguing. Don't just listen to what somebody tells you at the top. Listen to what you see, and then ask some nosy questions. Ask questions about what's really happening to us. My second point, why do people keep going? Here, this is where it gets a little painful, especially for white people. Because here, the history of racism is something that also keeps us going without asking too many questions. Racism, in many ways, helps us to maintain the status quo, and not only to keep Black people down, but also to keep white people in their place. That may come as a surprise, but let me explain what I mean here. By the way, here you have a couple of images. I forgot to show you my next slide of these religious ideas that may not really help us here, that might actually mislead us more than they help us build alternative relationships to each other and alternative economic relationships. So here, this book you should really note and read if you can, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. The author is Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, a young academic who's doing phenomenal work there. I'll give you one quote from her book. If you want to look it up, it's on page 210. She says, "White supremacy did not mean that whites were to be supreme. Instead, it was a political strategy intended to manipulate racial fears as a means of managing class rule for the landed elite of the cotton-rich Black Belt. White supremacy has historically existed to marginalize Black influence in social, political, and economic spheres, while also obscuring major differences in experience in social, political, and economic spheres among white people." Let me read that last sentence again. White supremacy has historically existed to, one, marginalize Black influence in social, political, and economic spheres, and two, while also obscuring major differences in experience in social, political, and economic spheres among white people. In other words, the white racists might think they're benefiting from dominant white supremacy, while in reality, it's the white ruling class, it's the plantation owners, it's the 1% or the 0.1% who are really, really benefiting from racism. And the other white people are still benefiting, don't worry about that. But it's not working for them the way they think it is. In other words, somebody who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, some white racists there in the crowd might have thought they're fighting for themselves. Well, they were really fighting for somebody else, right? Back then, that was Donald Trump. Now, it's certain white interests that they might not be aware of. So I put these two terms here, divide and conquer. You know this one, right? This is always happening in capitalism. You divide working people from each other. You divide white and Black working people. Even when you talk about working people, people think this is talking about white people now, not realizing that most working people are not white and perhaps not even, white male and the sort of people that we think of when we say the working class. The working class is actually quite diverse. So divide and conquer here is the way to control working people. So that's why they keep going, because they fight each other. But think of unite and conquer also. That's a term that I've made up that's not quite as common. And what I mean by that is that racism, white supremacy, uniting white people creates a false identity where white people think they're all winning together. What's happening to the white billionaires, the white racists think is what's happening to them. And of course, that's not true, right? That's the idea that you have to question. So what you're conquering then is by uniting white people, is you're conquering black people. And you're conquering most white people too, because they're not winning this either. The same is true for nationalism, patriotism. We've seen this in fascism in Germany. You bring all the German people together thinking that Hitler's interests are their interests, or Krupp Steel's interests are their interests, or IBM's interests are their interests. All these were players in Nazi Germany, right? And that's not true. So here, unite and conquer is something else that keeps people going against their own interests. I'll give you one more. Here, I'd say what keeps people going is that they can't really imagine real alternatives. Test yourself here. What do you, personal question here, not about others, but about yourself. What do you find easier to imagine? Is it the end of the world, or is it the end of capitalism? Very seriously, right? I mean, we've all had visions of the end of the world, either, by a climate change, or maybe nuclear holocausts, or, maybe just Jesus coming back and blowing everything to pieces. And a lot of people find that easier to imagine than the end of capitalism. And if you did a survey, some people have done it, there's a lot of people who find it much easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So can we imagine real alternatives? Maybe not. And that's, of course, part of the problem that we're going to address in this class. But keep in mind, just letting your imagination go wild and have some wild ideas about how the economy could be better might not help a great deal either. So imagining some utopia instead of the end of the world or the end of capitalism might not be quite the way to go either. So we're not just dreaming about what we would wish to see. We also have to look at what's really going on. And so here, what theologians often do is something I do not want to do in this class, and this is really important. Theologians oftentimes, there are a couple of big ideas put out there by the economists. Then the theologians come and they pick a couple of ideas and they put them up against the idea. So it's a struggle of ideas, They say competition, I say love, they say merit, I say gift, they say work, I say grace, blah, 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 blah. Sorry to be so blatant here. I'll give you the idea of sharing as an example here, right? We all should share. Sharing would be better than just, hoarding. I think greed is worse than sharing. We would all agree on that. But what really do we mean when we say it? And this is where we're opening ourselves up to all kinds of interesting nonsense questions, ultimately. I remember students of mine asking whether I'd be willing to share my toothbrush. And I say, well, if that's what you mean by sharing, you sort of really not understood anything that sharing could even mean. Would you want to share your underwear, or would you want to share, all kinds of things? It's an absurd discussion that doesn't help anybody. So if you talk about sharing abstractly or as a great idea, it could lead to absurd ideas or simply ideas that are not going to happen. This is utopian in a bad sense. So here, eventually we'll have to talk about socialisms because when there is conversations about socialism, we really have to get a clear idea of what does it make sense to share and what doesn't have to be shared. There's some limits here. Not all socialisms are created equal either. Keep that in mind. And once you move on, even some liberation ideas are not helpful when they talk about just God in terms of disembodied ideas. What does it mean really to talk about God as liberator? When's the last time you've seen God hurl a lightning bolt from the sky and hit somebody? You wish it would happen, but it usually hits the wrong people if it hits. So here too, dreaming of some divine power that might save us, just because this is a beautiful idea or because you read a nice passage in the Bible might not quite do the trick either. So let me be a little harsh here on my own guilt, because simply putting theology against economic ideas is not the way forward. The problem, I think, is that we're not teaching the history of alternatives much. And here, this is another quiz. I'll come to a conclusion pretty soon, but let me add a few more ideas before I close. When you think about these ideas, when you think about the history of alternatives, well, you all know there's a minimum wage in this country, but do you also know why there is a minimum wage? Well, I Googled it, and what Google tells me is it goes back to some congressional action. So we have a minimum wage, Google says, because Congress made a decision and signed a bill. But you know what's missing here, right? I know many of you know it, and if you don't, ask the labor movement, how organizing working people to actually put on some pressure on politicians and Congress was needed to actually get a minimum wage. It wasn't just politicians coming together or some enlightened business people or economists or theologians that said we needed a minimum wage. It was working people organizing. Same question, why is there protection for women at work? Why did child labor end? Well, of course, it's a matter of policy, but where does this policy come from? Not from somebody who once had a great idea that women ought to be able to vote. Well, great ideas are fine, but they're not going to get this done. It was by women organizing, it was by the labor movement organizing for protection of women at work and ending child labor. Why is there a 40-hour work week, right? Same question. It wasn't some enlightened companies saying, oh, well, workers shouldn't work so hard. It was working people organizing. It all goes back to the agency of organized people. So the question here is agency and transformation. Those are the two things we will be talking about a lot more. And if you want to look this up, those were the two things I presented in this recent webinar with Cornel West and Cynthia Molabida and Angela Kauser, where I talked about how Christianities and socialisms could be in conversation. The two things here that really matter, not big government bureaucracy, not Big Brother, not somebody figuring it out for you, but people's agency leading to transformation. There are some pieces that were written on the topic, and if you want to read my piece, you can go to this website here, and this is on our Wendling Cook Programs website. That might be of interest to you anyways, but look at this interventions forum on Christianities and socialisms, and you get some of these ideas. So I don't have to talk about them much here now, but it's all about the question of agency and actual transformation. And then it's not a matter of ideas, but observing where it happens, looking at the history, looking at the present, and then thinking about the future. How can we build this thing that's already going on? In my own commitment here, I want to make this clear before I close. There are two things that have helped me not only hopefully get a few things done, but really help me ground my own theological reflections, because ultimately I'm a theologian. We have to talk theology. But it's not so much ideas and the books you see behind me, even though those are important. It's really based in actual movement. So here's one. The labor movement. We don't talk about that much in the US anymore, but we should. And the things that we're most proud of have oftentimes been accomplished by the labor movement, women's right at work, benefits, shorter work days, protections. The list goes on and on. You know what I'm talking about. And if not, Google it. Next time you take the weekend off work, thank the labor movement. The other one we will be talking about a lot more is worker cooperatives. So this is another way of organizing working people's agencies. There's some work that we're doing here locally through the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development in Nashville. And here's another conversation that might be of interest. You can read up some of this about cooperatives and faith communities. The contributions are by some really phenomenal people. If you have never heard of Jessica Gordon Impart, for instance, check her out. Her book on African-American worker co-ops is setting the standard. Then you have Gilda Haas, who is very involved, and several other people that I can only recommend. And if you want to read ahead for some of the things where I see hope happening and where faith is also springing again in new ways, those are the movements. I'll stop here. I've probably been talking a little too long, but there's a lot that needs to be said, and I'll make sure my lectures in the future are going to be a little bit shorter. So thank you.
No problem. Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things, maybe a few questions just about what you just said before jumping into things people send in about the reading or and such. But one that is in the chapter of your book you spend quite a bit of time dealing with, and you mentioned it here, is how economics comes to function as a religion. And you brought up a couple phrases while you were talking that are part of the piety of American religion, and if right, our true religion, it's not just Christianity as if that's value neutral for the economy, but Christianity as kind of therapeutically compliant to the formation of the self in a system of exploitation. Then those piety phrases you mentioned, like God helps those who help themselves, God is in control, God never fails. There's more getting itself done than feeling awkward at a funeral. And one of the things that struck me, even thinking of some of the messages ministers have sent, in anticipation of the first session, is that when you're a minister, those theological commitments that come across as blind, naive faith, right, are problematic. So, God needed another angel in heaven, God's in control. And you're like, no, there's not a good reason for an infant to die, right? That's just not good. So don't go needed a new angel, right? But underneath that there's this bit of reality that's bad, and we need it to fit in order and a structure so it can have meaning. Because if we acknowledge that the order is not on our side, if we acknowledge that the system is problematic, then all of a sudden there's a new anxiety that we just can't trust our quote normal. And I think ministers see this theologically before a lot of their congregants do, because you are the one they call when marriages come apart, when children are hurt, you're in the hospital holding hands and last breaths. And I think that correlation to the economy is something ministers see first as well, that we don't talk about the economic struggles, or that someone isn't coming to church because they can't tithe, or that this family lost up. There's so many things that run parallel, because we all have agreed this picture of faith that works with the economy, and this picture of American economy or whatever that works and it's all equal, and if you just try hard, it's all good. Both of those, we're more ashamed to be the exception. And ministers struggle to make space for people to lament and to have pain. But we don't know what it would be like to show up and give people space, to be cast aside, to be the underside of the American economic system. And I knew congregants when I worked at a church of the 1% in Los Angeles for 8 years Palos Verdes Estates, our neighbor, was Donald Trump's golf course. So I'm not exaggerating on who were the congregants here at a UCC church. But
That's what he calls himself, the Church of the 1%, or well, that's what you call it, right?
yeah, that's that, and I just, like, you drew that analogy, but just that experience of ministering and reading some of the emails from ministers, I think it's similar, because the honest moments with your congregants. Our shitty theology doesn't work for real life. Also, the ideology we give about how to succeed and try hard and it works out and it's all mostly going for the good doesn't work.
And I think that is the crucial point, Trip. But once we get to that point, once you hit rock bottom somewhere, and it could be anywhere, it could be, when something bad happens to good people, right? I mean, when a child dies, for instance, in a congregation, what a horrible moment, right? But also, when bad economic things happen. But normally, the way we respond to that in both cases, when a child dies, of course, the pastor has to give, some care, do some counseling and all of that. But the idea is, how do we bring that family back into a normal situation so that they don't interrupt the congregation's business, right? So that they somehow, they get comforted, they're okay, but make sure they're not gonna raise big questions for us in our images of God. So you have to contain it. What you could do, what I think we should be doing is, if something like that happens, you now have the responsibility to raise these God questions. And of course, since children die all the time, everybody has this responsibility. If it's not your children, they're children elsewhere in this country and around the world. So that's the first point. And the same is true for the economy. When bad things happen, those are theological questions. And if we don't raise them, we're basically just keeping the status quo going. And we're then in cahoots with this false or blind religion, whatever you want to call it. Unfortunately, though, a lot of us, if you're a pastor, of course, especially, don't have any other options, because this is also how the money flows. This is who pays for, the salary and the various things that you need to make it yourself. And so we have a bit of a dilemma here, but I think the theological task is pretty clear. What happens if we raise some of these tough questions? Well, the good news is, not only might we find a much deeper image of God, we might find a better image of ourselves. And finally, we might find some real solutions, because right now, all we do is we try to sort of bring more people into the American dream that is failing us.
Oh yeah. Okay. So, and I think the predicament you gave there of the minister and such it's not the only discipline that's the case, right? But because of the podcast and having a high concentration of people that really like their theology classes, went into debt at prestigious mainline Protestant seminaries so they could study with high quality teachers, and then they get a job in that mainline Protestant setting that loves for you to make reference to theologians, as long as it doesn't jeopardize the fact that the primary function of that denomination, and we can see it denomination fights, or the congregation, it's fidelity to an institution that has successfully chaplained empire in America for a long time. And then, and I know this is one of my experiences, and I shared a bit about kind of awakening to this while I was in school as a religion and musical theater major. But there is a sense that by the time you kind of go, oh, jump, you're saying that that Jesus and the kingdom of God, or this whole vision that it was going on, like, might not mean that I succeed by training people to be excellent citizens and workers, and that for justice and peace and liberty, these types of things, that might not mean just the success of our current nation state that happens to be the the current imperial ruler. Like, you come to these conclusions while you're going in debt And guess what you have to do to pay off your student loans as a mainline Protestant minister? Go to a church where everyone else that is successful at this church and tithe also has a lot of student loans to get their degrees so they could be lawyers or engineers or whatever. And so, like, there's this situation where what you would hope to happen, to encounter, right, deep discipleship and questions around justice and community and all these types of things, you're already in a type of uh, imaginative debt slavery where you know that you get stuck in that situation. I feel like we're like Zacchaeus. You know that you're kind of screwing all the other Jewish people, but someone's going to do it. So you got to do it. And you already owe them a lot of money for your debt. And it's not like if you opt out, they're like, well, we're going to forgive Trip your loans for going to Wake Forest University's Divinity School or Vanderbilt's or whatever. There's just always this tension going on. And it's not just it's not just Divinity School, but I think that when you sent me the titles, you're like, we're screwed and we know it. I think that's the secret a lot of people keep in. How many 35-year-olds that I know would opt out of all the decisions they did to get stuck with little options for actually living out deep passions, vocations, and making a difference in the world? And so I feel like that element, when I saw the title of this, is what popped up. And I know so many ministers who feel that way, who then tell me the 5 or 6 people in their congregation that do. Like a lawyer that can't, right, spend a lot of time doing labor law or environmental law to try to make a difference because they're defending patents for the military industrial complex to pay off law school.
So in a way, it's true that we're stuck, and a lot of us are stuck that way. But now the picture shifts too, because if you think about who all is stuck, there is more of us that are stuck than those that are not stuck. So once you think of it this way, and once you think about that, those of us who are stuck and those of us who are struggling have these questions. What if we came together? What if we raised them together? What if we backed each other up and we're building something that way, rather than this ongoing divide and conquer and unite and conquer, where you cannot raise these questions. So what we really have to do, this is where organizing becomes important. This is where thinking about what did Jesus actually do. People think Jesus was a great theologian, maybe a radical preacher, but he was really organizing people. So you do your theology and you organize, you raise these questions and you organize, and they're the big theological questions. I know your audience, people reading process theology, they're not too shocked questioning things like omnipotence. But when you think from the bottom up, from the death of a child, or from financial destruction in people's lives, you raise similar questions. Maybe you've never heard of Whitehead, but this is a question that you must raise. It's not just because you're so smart and philosophically interested, but because the world does not work that way. Now, the beauty of it is, Trip, and this is where I'm getting my energy and why I'm doing my work, is that there are answers. There is ways of addressing that. So we're not despairing and saying, well, that now means we cannot talk about God anymore, but we need to talk about God differently. We need to find God differently. We need to build power differently. And so a lot of the responses that people then give to what's wrong doesn't really take into account these alternatives. And if we do, I think we get something else, and hopefully we can figure that out in the next couple of sessions, and some of it starting today in this course.
Yeah, and I think the fact that so many more people are asking the question is important, right? Until there are communities disturbed by the right problems, you're not going to get communities that embody like living alternatives. And one of the things that you point at, and I know comes up later in the book in No Rising Tide, is how it wasn't accidental that organized labor is marginalized in American history, right? Like you gave the example of the movement for against child labor or the minimum wage, right? And that one version of the story is you just acknowledge the political process of passing the law, but the other side of it is the principalities and powers don't pass those laws on accident, right? So the who was it that was creating the situation and pushing and applying the pressure, and it was the movement. So there's that kind of reciprocal moment, and I think that a lot of the questions that are coming up today are a generation after the boomers, where there's a large collection who don't believe the kind of Thatcher "there is no other option" line. Because if there's no other option, then we're either not creative or destined to destruction. When you feel, when you have more and more people feeling that. So I wonder if you could share a bit about that history. How do you see that movement from going to places like, where you have like the New Deal and a president being pressured by organized labor, by the Socialist Party in America and stuff, in labor in the UK and things, to there's no other option? And what is it like for this moment to have a growing number of people go, that can't be true, right? Even though it was so assumed by a lot of our the previous generation.
See, that's the ultimate theological statement. That was Thatcher, right? And the abbreviation in Europe was always TINA. There is no other alternative. That's the ultimate theological statement. There is nothing but this, if anybody has any questions about whether economics can function as a religion, well, here politics and economics hand in hand. There is no alternative to capitalism, is what this meant. Now, the reality is there have always been alternatives. That's, of course, part of the history I think we have to re-narrate. There have always been alternatives in our own country, in the United States. We're not just talking about Europe. There have been various forms of socialisms. I see this one question in the chat where somebody asks, why socialisms is plural. Well, because there were different opportunities. There were different ways of moving forward. There were the utopian socialism, where people sort of started new communities, new cities. They were doing things together. A lot of them failed precisely because they were a little too utopian. That might not be the way forward. There were other sort of socialisms that some of them were sort of noblesse oblige socialisms, where wealthier people, or people in the middle class, or maybe even people in the ruling class, felt we have to take care of the poor, and of working people. Those are great. It's great to help people, but it doesn't change the system. It simply does something. Charity, philanthropy is great, but it doesn't change the way money is made and money is lost. But these things have always existed. And so not to talk about them, I think, is really the problem. And of course, today, when people say socialism, they think, first of all, socialism is big government bureaucracy that controls everything, that controls welfare. That's another form of social democracy that certainly has a long history in Europe. And some of it we see in the United States and also in Canada. But if socialism is ultimately not any of the things I've mentioned, I'd say it really has to do, again, back to people's agency. So this is not about what somebody else can do for you or somebody's wonderful dreams, but where working people in history have successfully organized in order to change the world. That's the socialisms that I think are really most worth examining, and that have never left us. If you sort of think about this, even in political history, I mean, how was slavery ended in the United States? Well, people think Lincoln ended slavery. Well, yeah, I mean, eventually you have a president and you have a Congress and all of that. That plays a role, no doubt. But it was the abolitionists. It was the slaves themselves fighting. It was a broad-based movement where pressure was brought to bear on a system that could not last. And we have that history time and again, in our own country, abolition, women's suffrage, right to vote, the civil rights movement, Black Lives Matter movement now, Occupy Wall Street movement. Those are things that have already happened and that keep happening. Those are all alternatives. It's just that we don't want to take them seriously. And I think that's the mistake. Then we'd rather talk about ideas than about people organizing and building power. But those histories, by the way, go back a long time. I mean, I just talked about the US, you could talk about Europe, but talk about the beginning of the Abrahamic religions, right? Abrahamic religions, meaning Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We'll talk about that next week. What images they share of God, the Exodus is part of it, and so on. There's a lot there where God is not the ultimate capitalist. There's no alternative, but God is the one who provides the alternatives and who is right there when the slaves organize and move.
Yeah. So I want to make sure we deal with the text specifically that people have read or might read after this, because I know that some people jump in and read them after they get some framework for it. And I have a couple of questions that are around the article, the socio-psychological effects of the money civilization on different classes. And one of the elements that comes up in that chapter and throughout a lot of our reading, and it will continue, is the transition into a neoliberal moment. And there's lots of debate around that, what that word is. But I think it would be helpful to look at least how you'll use the word. Like how are you using it, and what is the transition or predicaments that come up that you're trying to emphasize? Like the text, notes deregulation, liberalization, privatization. I know other thinkers will pick out different features, but I think knowing that people have even already asked, what does this word mean?
Yes.
To pause for a minute on that. And while you're doing that, I'm going to check it. Who's knocking at my door? I'm guessing a kid woke up, but I'll be right back.
Of course, yes. Yeah, yeah. That is an important question, and of course, when we talk about neoliberalism, right, it refers to capitalism. So we're talking about neoliberal capitalism, and what the word liberal means here is basically, the words that have already been mentioned: deregulation. In other words, deregulating businesses, corporations, international free trade agreements. That happens not just at the national level; it happens at the international level. It's a broad program where over the years, the past basically 40 years, a bit more, this has all put into effect. Liberalization here is sort of going along the same route. Privatization, putting more and more of the economic interests into private hands, away from public interests. And public interests, mind you, are not just governments. People think, well, public is the government, but ultimately, who is the government, right? The government is us. And we have something to do with it. It's not a few bureaucrats in Washington primarily. So neoliberalism here moves via deregulation, liberalization, putting more into private hands, and at the same time, it's fewer and fewer private hands. In the U.S., we sort of make it look like the country is built on small businesses. But the majority of us is employed, and the majority of money, of course, is made by a few small corporations at the top. And somebody who runs a family business might think they have more in common with the Waltons of Walmart or Bezos of Amazon than with their workers. The reality is, most business people, small business people for sure, have much more in common with the people with which they work, usually side by side. But neoliberalism, sort of by funneling it all, not just into private hands, but into fewer and fewer private hands, we're all, not we are all, but a lot of us have shares, stocks. But there's a difference between a shareholder and the majority shareholders, or the large shareholders. Keep that in mind also. And one more thing I want to mention here, this is a word that probably many of you have heard, and if not, look it up, the structural adjustment policies. This is another thing, you think neoliberalization happens by making everything more and more liberal. But in many cases, businesses, work relationships, projects were violently split apart, broken apart by these so-called structural adjustment policies that destroyed communal efforts, that destroyed community efforts in building alternatives in order somehow to guarantee more freedom. But that's weird, right? They were sort of curtailing people's freedom in order to gain freedom. And the question is always, whose freedom? And as I said during my presentation, I bring this back here. At the same time that the economy was more and more deregulated, the labor movement in the United States was more and more regulated. Organizing became a lot more difficult. So not only organizing new workers is now extremely difficult, this may be changing again under the new administration. But even sort of keeping unions together is difficult, and we can talk about the technicalities there more and more. But regulation for the people, regulation when it comes to a lot of people who do the work, and deregulation when it comes to a few of the top moneyed interests. That's sort of an interesting thing that is oftentimes not seen together.
Mm-hmm. So,
And of course, maybe one more thing, the basic
yeah.
idea of market, of this neoliberalism is that the best way to negotiate economic interests is on the market. On a market.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not opposed to markets, for instance. This surprises some people. They think when you're interested in socialism, you have to be opposed to markets. You have, the only option you have is 5-year plans. That is not true. But the question is, who runs the market? What's actually dominating the market? Are buyers and sellers on the same platform? Who has the power? Who doesn't? When you talk about consumers, we think we are a consumer-driven economy. That's why we need neoliberalism. But are consumers running the show, or is something else running the show? Whose interests? Those are all questions. And then you really have to talk about what might the alternatives be.
Yeah. So that article struck me in a rather profound way. And I love the way it frames itself by introducing relational psychology up front. And I know it gives a really, I think, helpful introduction. But what it doesn't state explicitly, I thought is worth noting and would be interested in your thought. Like, there's kind of a subtle contrast running through it that is connected to the critique of kind of the financialization of relationships. Is that there's a contrast between how psychology understands the self developing and emerging in community, the way anxiety exists in healthy ways in community, and the way it in perverse ways, the way fear is dealt with in a community of trust and mutual well-being, and the way fear functions right in a world of eat or be eaten, right? Like, and there are all these layers of and underneath it, relational psychology enables you to critique something that's essential to the neoliberal constitution of the self, namely the kind of misplaced concreteness around individualism. That if you isolate problems and then point at them, right? Oh, you're poor, it's your problem, right? Think the prosperity gospel in the article, along with, right, capitalism. The poor person, the individual is the problem, and so the remedy is to help the individual. And so much of our in psychology, the things insurance companies will give you money for are if you treat symptoms that an individual has, but it doesn't acknowledge the fact that the individuals, based on large volumes of psychological research, have these issues because their relational network is wonderfully toxic, exploitative, and problematic for the flourishing of humanity. Right? Like I felt like there was like one paragraph out of that article that just pointed that out, because I got to the end and looked at my notes and said, well, that's obvious. and it was always subtle. So like how do you see that? Because to me, it just seemed that the whole article is pointing out the way in which if the problem is always given to the individual, then the story we tell about the problem isn't the toxicity of relations. It's not a relational problem. It's a substantive problem that we put on a person. And once you identify a patient, then the toxicity of relations is now ignored because you're treating the symptoms performed in the individual.
So there are two things I want to highlight here, and this is another place where I think theology is really helpful, because ultimately what we're talking about is relationships. So I mean, theology is all about relationships, and of course, when you talk about relationships, you have to think power also. It's not just sort of relationships without power. But we already talked about the God-human relationship, sort of this top-down thing that economics as religion and false religion envision. That doesn't work. So we have to find something else. And now we're talking about, sort of the relationship of us human beings to whatever is happening in the system and to other human beings. And that very quickly gets ignored also. Individualism, of course, is the big trick here that's played on us, right? The idea is, we're supposed to believe that we're all individuals. And then, of course, the people at the top, the Jeff Bezoses, they can say, we built this because we're the greatest individual of all, because we're brilliant. We've done this. We've worked extremely hard for it. We own it. While the truth is, the higher you go, the more connected you are. I mean, Bezos could not do a thing without an Amazon warehouse worker. So he may be the most connected person, just covering it up. So relationship is always there. The worker on the other end also gets told, you're an individual. Which is, of course, not true either, because their fate and Bezos's fate is tied directly together. And in some ways, it's a zero-sum game. People say, oh, nothing's a zero-sum game anymore. This one is, because Bezos is doing extremely well, because these workers are not getting paid and not being treated well. Now, that's the labor relationship. That's also part of theological anthropology. We could talk about what's a human being. But you take that into the psychological relationship, and it's surprising to me why people don't make these connections. I mean, if there's things that bear down on your psyche, whatever comes from the inside is one thing. Now we're a little more enlightened. We talk about family systems. Whatever happens in your family, well, sure, that will certainly can drive you crazy, what's happening in your family. But what's happening at work, that's where you spend the bulk of your waking hours. So you may spend more time at work than you spend time with your children, except when it's COVID, of course. And not to examine that, I think is just a huge mistake, certainly by the professions here, but also by theologians, because we talk about the human beings as if we're somewhere out there in space, while in reality, it's these relationships, and it's these relationships of labor that are making us sick. I have a book here I wanted to show you and everybody else. This is one of my colleagues here at Vanderbilt Divinity School, Bruce Rogers Vaughan, Caring for Souls in a Neoliberal Age. Bruce is teaching pastoral care here at Vanderbilt Divinity School. And what he's doing is he's precisely talking about these, relational psychological processes in relation to how that shapes up with a market economy that's basically driving us all crazy.
That's literally one of the best books ever.
Well, I thank you. Yes, I mean, it's actually in one of my series, New Approaches to Religion and Power, is a series at Palgrave Macmillan that I'm editing.
And that book is so good. I'll share in the group. Bruce and I talked about it for probably 2 hours. Like it, and it's one of the most popular episodes from last year on the podcast because it got shared and it led to emails, a lot of which were the initiation of, us doing this class after they heard him and then read the book.
And if
Um,
anybody, out there, anybody needs a justification for, why we now should be talking about capitalism as theologians and as counselors and as psychoanalysts and anything, the basic answer is simply because capitalism affects everything. It's not just a matter of the pocketbook. It's not just a matter of politics. Well, we know that, but is really shaping us all the way to the core, including, of course, that's where I'm really interested, our images of God, our
mhm.
faith, our theological concepts, but it's shaping our personal relationships. It's shaping our psyche, our imaginations, our desires, uh, and that will come back probably next time or in 2 weeks, because that has to be dealt with, this whole question of desire. Because moralizing, if you're that deep into the problem, moralizing is not going to help you.
Yeah. So, one of the questions that came in different ways from the I'm signing up for this, but my experience as someone of privilege is not one that would lead me to naturally question the whole economic system, but I'm having doubts and such. Uh, what do you do with anthropology? And I think this article and in your chapter, it brings it up. And my thesis that I mentioned to you in my notes is that uh, you know Descartes, Hume, Locke in the reading all play particular roles in setting up what you could call the capitalist anthropology, the capitalist understanding of the self. And the way that ends up getting performed in a contemporary context is where capitalists go like, look, thank you, Darwin. Survival of the fittest, you know, uh, nice guys get eaten first, stuff like that. And so, what do you do with this particular anthropology that now has one type of kind of like biological justification? Then you go like, markets are natural if you don't want to be horrible. Like, you call them exploitative market trips, but that's because you spent too much time on the beach when you were in Los Angeles, you're too hippy dippy. But honestly, like if we didn't have markets, Hobbes is right, Descartes, Hume, Locke, they all agree with me. Um, and and I wonder if part of that kind of capitalist anthropology, where a particular account of the self and a particular account of our biology doesn't, in some sense, naturalize the exploitative power regime of the market. And so we just assume it is the case. It is natural. This is as good as we can do. And so then what are we stuck doing? Fine tuning. We redistribute things. We try to protect more people's rights or that type of stuff. But we don't question whether or not the anthropology underneath it that justifies it is true. And in your book and in this article, it problematizes it. And as someone spending a lot of time in a research project currently on religion, science, and the nature of humanity, in contemporary science, the extended synthesis, all the ways in which culture and community and cooperation play a role in the story of evolution, over against the neo-Darwinist account, where our genes, right, of the and such are have this kind of closed system of competition, and where you get something like selfish gene and thing. I feel like biology and systems biology and things are pointing to the fact that cooperative communitarian power is essential for the flourishing of human life and ecosystems and such. But and now that story we said was natural, Descartes, Hume, Locke, Hobbes, Darwin, is seen as the cover story for exploitative capitalism and the capitalist anthropology. but that's pulling together stuff from your chapter and this one. And
Yeah.
I wonder what you thought. Like, that's what I've been thinking about this week in doing the reading.
Yes, those are really great questions, and some people might be impatient and say, what do we do with all that? How do we actually make a difference? Let me assure those people we're getting there, because we really need to address some of these fundamentals. I mean, if you believe that organizing people, building community power can make a difference, you need a different anthropology than the ones that we're being sold. And without that, all you can do is sort of tinker, have a couple of remedies here, or maybe try to put a social net under something that's not sustainable, and that doesn't work either. So those are really the fundamental questions. And this basic idea that somehow we're all individuals, that we're all sort of most successful, when we're on our own, when we operate as individuals. That is actually the lie. We had a president just recently, who no longer is president, who basically made it look like he alone can solve our problems. But how many shoulders he stood on, right? How many people actually enabled what he was doing, all the way to the people that were mowing the lawns in some of his hotel properties, right? That had no choice but to back this up. So this idea of individualism, I think, is one of the biggest lies that capitalism has invented. It is the story of the powerful to tell themselves and everybody else, we won because we're so powerful. That's not true. And if you ever want to double check that, tell your mother that you're a strong individual, and she'll tell you who started cleaning your diapers, and teaching you and getting you to where you are. But that's a much bigger problem. So here, I think a lot of these ideas of what's natural, the way nature functions, are really distorted social ideas that then get introduced into biology without people really being aware of where this is coming from. Now, this is, of course, where Darwin, I think, gets really misused also. We call it now social Darwinism, with this idea of the survival of the fittest. And then we define what fittest means. We think we know what it means. People with the most money, people with the most privilege, and so on. But that too is not what Darwin was talking about, and that's not how history works necessarily either. Because the survival of the people at the top, the empires, go back to the Roman Empire. Once it lasted, people thought it was everlasting. Of course, the Roman Empire is no more, right? Neither is any of the medieval empires, and the British Empire is not doing that great either. So people thinking, this top-down power of the individual strong man, no need to be inclusive here. This is a male fantasy too. Is natural. That's, of course, I think we're really seeing that's not working anymore. So that opens up the question of alternatives. And like you're saying, Trip, there's now different ways of reading natural history. I read this piece recently, a sermon that somebody preached that was titled, "The Forest is Full of Socialists." Oh my God, the forest is full of socialists. What is going on? Well, what he was talking about is the fact that trees communicate via their roots, not only information, but perhaps also other sort of benefits that come to them when they're connected. There's a natural socialism out there where it's the biggest and the best tree that wins. It's all the trees together, right? You see this in the animal kingdom. I mean, a lot of it has to be studied there in details because species are different. But there is a lot collaboration happening, and there's a lot also, controlling dominant power. If you think about bees, for instance, the queen, we think of the queen as somehow a tyrant. But the queen is actually just a function in a bee population. It's not the authority command center that tells every other bee what to do, but it's a wholly different system, and so there's all kinds of I think things that we can learn even from a different observation of nature. But take that back to anthropology. This idea that people are basically self-centered and selfish. Well, there's some of that out there, but we have created an economic system that reinforces that to a degree that is deadly, not just to people, but to the whole planet. There are other economic systems that have functioned very well that still take into account people's self motivation. there's nothing wrong with having some self-interest, as I see it. You don't have to be completely altruistic, but you don't need a system where somebody's self-interest can now ruin the lives of millions and billions of people. That's just not necessary.
Mhm.
Maybe one more thing for the people that know they're privileged. Do not ever confuse privilege and power. Because you may be a very privileged person, you may have a swimming pool and a couple of cars, and living a good life, and all of that. But that does not necessarily mean that you're running the show. You're not running the county, probably where you live. You're certainly not running the country. I guarantee you. You may not be running your own church either, because you need other people to run it, right? And so confusing privilege and power, I think, is one of the biggest mistakes that people make. And therefore, they don't understand that they too are not winning, because you'd be winning if you had the control, if you had the power. But if you don't, you may not even guarantee the success of your own children. You might not even guarantee that your parents are going to be safe. So you may have some privilege, and you should take that into account and deal with it. But do not give in to the fantasy that therefore you're running the world. You're probably not. And that too means that you have to think more collectively in terms of how you actually get things done.
Mhm. So when you gave the example of kind of like trees and the way they relate to the world, it's kind of fascinating. One of the research projects I'm working on right now is how the where you define the study of or the locus of assessment, like an individual tree, and how you define the scale, the length of time, and that type of stuff, leads you to ignore genuine relations. So, a friend of mine's working on a research project on how trees actually communicate within the ecosystem, and you don't notice it except for the functionalist account, how the trees interact over time on a longer time scale because trees live longer, then until you recognize the way fungi play a role in tree to tree communication in an ecosystem. And then there are particular beetles in this part of the Amazon that she's working on a research project on that play a role related to the fungi that then communicate to the trees, that if you don't think of our year but a tree year, which in the germination cycle in the Amazonian ecosystem is more like 8. So then if you take like a 10-year span, you can actually see the way the fungi, these beetles, and the trees communicate and respond. And I give that as an example because what you decide matters then silences large parts of the relational network, and they don't count. And one of the things that comes up both in this text and in the text looking at how the multitude functions in Mark, right? And the role of the temple and the critique of power. And that's what, once you decide what our measurements are and what our scales are, then you've already silenced a lot of other voices that are just present. And I think that is one of the types of suspicion that are important to cultivate if you're going to learn to engage your tradition, engage your sacred text, and then engage your community, and try to peel back the stories you were told are true that are really the cover story for the imperial agenda.
And now you plug that back into this idea of the survival of the fittest, and you wonder, who's actually surviving here. I mean, I've already said that the empires, by and large, all collapsed, and ours will be no different. It will not be forever, will not be eternal. Capitalism will not last. Don't worry. But the question is, what then? And what I see, if I look at history, I see these people's movements. I see power that keeps bubbling up, that cannot be controlled, that really comes from the 99%, as it were, working people, organized power, and that cannot be stopped, and it hasn't been stopped at any point throughout history, no matter how much people have tried. And that to me is part of that good news. So if you think about the Jesus movement, and think of Jesus as an organizer of a movement rather than just a preacher or a great theologian, uh, that was part of a much older organizing tradition. I mean, they didn't invent it; they perfected it. Perhaps they did a few things to it, but it's still with us, and it keeps bubbling up. And they would, of course, love to put this to sleep, but they can't. And ultimately, what moves us forward here, I think, is these alternative people's traditions. It's just that we're not talking about it, we're not reminding ourselves of it, we're not celebrating it. But that's what's going to change here, and I think this is why we're doing the course.
Yeah. Okay. So there are a number of concepts that came up in the reading, and I thought we could play a game where I name the concept and then you say whatever you want to say about it that will give the reader some idea of what's going on when it comes up. Because uh, I've had people message me about some of them and others that were like, how did I not know this concept? The moment it exists, things make different sense. And I say that because one of the goals, right, of what reading particular text or like spending time, uh, you know, in kind of intellectual engagement around ideas is because there's always this tension between our conceptual pictures and praxis. And we're always praxis is always happening. But if we don't attend to our vision of the world and the way the ideas relate and such, we will be, incarnating in a sense uh, ideologies that are against our well-being, our neighbors' well-being, and our enemies' well-being, and the flourishing of life on the planet. And so, sometimes the greatest gift we give is just people a concept to lose a little bit of sleep about. So,
Sounds good. Yeah, let's play the game.
all
Looking
right,
forward to it.
all right. So the first one is lordless slavery. What is lordless slavery?
Yeah, wow. I'm also looking at the time. I could give very long answers, but I'll give shorter answers just to make sure that we get a few
Yeah,
more
that
of
was
those.
the game concept,
Yeah,
was
yeah,
attempting to be short.
exactly.
I
So
realized I
so
enjoyed talking to you too much.
yeah, yeah, no, same here. I really like our conversation, Trip. I mean, this one could be a dangerous one if one sort of misuses this idea of slavery and says, there's a lot of problems with slavery. But for us in the United States, for sure, we always have to think about how slavery shaped up in our own country, and that certainly was not lordless. I mean, this was
Hmm.
people with whips, and abusing other people in tremendous ways. The lordless one is, when you have systems that are no longer as visible. And capitalism is really good at lordless slavery because you may know you have a boss, but you're not really tied down with whips or chains or any of that. You may actually think this is your own free will, and then you're basically enslaving yourself. You don't even have anybody else doing it. And this is, as history goes on in neoliberal capitalism, I think that's more and more the problem, where people do not see their masters anymore, but they're still these masters. And the question then is, who benefits and who doesn't. So that points you towards, maybe not lordless completely, but it's hidden lords. And too often I think part of that is the psychological, you're enslaving, and this is a big word, it's a strong word, but enslaving yourself, meaning really you're handing your own self over to something that ultimately destroys you.
Hmm. Okay, so what about the multitude? This shows up in your work. It shows up in the chapter exploring the Gospel of Mark and the teachings on property.
So there's a biblical reference here. It comes from the New Testament. The Greek term is oklos, and oklos is, the people. It could be translated as the multitude. It's the mass of people. Maybe the masses, something like that. Korean Minjung theology picked that up in the 70s and 80s, where they were talking about the Minjung in Korea means this is the people, this is the common people. And so rethinking this multitude, not just as the people who Jesus cared for, this is where Jesus basically can be found, but also rethinking them as agents, people who can make a difference. Uh, the thing then gets picked up. Kwok Pui-lan, a colleague of mine, and I co-authored a book that was titled Occupy Religion, and the subtitle was Theology of the Multitude. So we're picking up the Minjung theology term, the gospel term, but we're also picking up a concept that was put out there by two well-known authors, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, that wrote a trilogy, a 3-series book on empire, and one of them was titled Multitude. So there's a bit of theory here, but what's interesting about the multitude is it talks about the community, it talks about the common people, and it talks about them as agents. So they're the agents that actually change the world. But it doesn't do so in terms of a unified thing. The German expression "das Volk," the people, is always a dangerous one because it oftentimes has been used for fascism, where the multitude then is not a diverse group of people that works together, but a very homogeneous group, that marches in lockstep, that has certain, biological traits or wears uniforms. So the multitude is different from that. It's not a solidarity of people who are alike. It's not nationalism. It's not racism. It's not the privilege banding together, but it's people out of their diversity being brought together. And the genius there is, this is where Jesus is organizing. This is where ultimate change is coming from. And maybe not changing the Roman Empire back then right away, but creating conditions where people survive and build a new life together.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so two more in a final question. One in James C. Scott has the concept of hidden transcripts, where the article says is to describe the concealed or disguised form of resistance or nonviolent acts of protest that you see show up in there. There you go.
I literally, people think we might have rehearsed this, but I had this book lying right next to my desk. So this is the book we're talking about, right? James C. Scott,
Yeah.
Domination and the Arts of Resistance. The cool thing about these hidden transcripts is the way Scott presents it. This is how people's movements actually make a difference. In other words, you may not see how they're making a difference. The way they communicate may not look to you, like it's something special or something revolutionary is happening. But there are these ways of communicating that are hidden to the powers that be, that the multitude, that the people that we just talked about have cultivated, and they understand each other. They can hear each other's language. Somebody else might not know what's going on, but the people are not stupid. And not only are they not stupid, they're organized, they're building power. And this is the way, Scott finds this in traditional society. So this is not just, a radical thing, where you have some movements that you may or may not have heard of, but this is how, people's resistance has functioned for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so what we're talking about here, that's the good news, I think, of our webinar. Ultimately, these are things that it's not like we have to produce and make them happen. They're already out there. So it's not like you have to listen to me and then you change the world. The world's already changing through these hidden transcripts. We have to figure out what they are, join, enhance, build on them, do something that makes a difference. But the beauty is these things are happening all the time. We're just not noticing them.
Mm-hmm. So there were a number of in each article, they kind of drew some timeline of the changing shape of empire, and one of them even said, "I love Jörg Rieger." He talks about the post-colonial shape of empire. So what is a post-colonial shape of empire? So because next week we're focusing on biblical texts and such, and looking at the biblical encounter with empire in Exodus, but when you think of how that's expressed today in a postmodern context, what's that look like?
So I actually coined that term. That was the last chapter of my book, Christ and Empire, that was published in 2007.
Which is the best article. It was the best chapter on Anselm. Like, if you just think of what has to happen to write a chapter on Anselm in a Christology book, where he's cultivated into a hero, I feel like. Did you feel good when you turned that in?
I did, but I really had worked on Anselm for a very long time at that time. I probably had started working on Anselm in the mid 1980s. So that took 20 years to get to
Okay,
that point.
he was one
Uh,
of my qualifying exams, uh, and because of that chapter, I got really into Anselm, and I'm like, I'm going to reclaim one of these theologians people just dismiss for relatively reasonable reasons. And anyway, that is a complete nerdy aside. But all right, post-colonial
no,
empire.
I love
Sorry.
it. So I mean, what I was doing in that book, though, I mean, maybe this helps to explain what I was saying. I'm going through all these movements, starting with Paul and the Nicene Creed, and then Anselm, and a few others that people usually think, this is all empire theology. And what I'm showing is that the empire never is able to overcome. Um, the resistance completely, and so you have I talk about it as the theological surplus that bubbles up sort of from below, pushing against the grain of empire. So you find some of this in Anselm, surprisingly. You find it in the post-colonial empire also. It's these people's movements that we keep talking about, and we'll talk a lot more specifically about the labor movement, worker cooperatives, and so on in future webinars. But for now, the reason I coined this term was, if you think about the colonial age, that's really over. Now, I know there are still some colonies. I'm not debating that, but the time when colonialism proceeded by one country running another country, like the British in India, sending a viceroy and a governor, and that sort of thing. That kind of a colonialism is by and large, it's no more. It's a post-colonial colonialism, though, because we found better ways of running other countries. So if you have an interest in India now, you do not have to conquer the country and send over a viceroy and a governor. You build economic relationships. That's the post-colonial piece. It's not the need for colonies, but it's certainly a more insidious way, perhaps, in a more effective way of building global power structures and building powerful corporations. Somebody who saw this is not well known, but Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, actually, in his own time, when Britain was a colonial empire, to be sure, Adam Smith did not like British colonialism. Um, well, because he was a capitalist who was smarter than the colonialists, because Smith realized colonialism was too cumbersome, too expensive, too much stuff involved that you didn't need. If all you wanted was to reap the profit, you didn't need all that government apparatus. And so the post-colonial empire is basically using some of these insights, saying, how can we actually run the world in a way that doesn't have to go through all this cumbersome government policy, but that's more effective, in that ultimately builds more power. So once you see it, then of course, the question is, and what's the alternative? And the good news for me is always, if there's these post-colonial moves towards power, there's post-colonial movements that are moving in the opposite direction, and that's what excites me, and also makes me hopeful that there is an alternative. Yes, so that's where we can close, Trip. Thatcher said there is no alternative. We're saying there is an alternative, and we're not just dreaming it up. We're seeing it. We can observe it. We'll talk about it more specifically, a lot more so in the future. There's somebody who's kept sending me emails asking questions about, and who are the economists that you're referencing? There's a lot of economists too, don't get me wrong. But before we go, just what the economists and the theologians say, let's look at what the movements are saying, what the people are saying, and what we can learn from them, and how we rebuild our theology in our economy on the basis of that.
All right. Okay, so this has been way too much fun for me. And you saw my list of topics and questions, which we barely got through some of them, which means we won't run out of things to talk about, Jorg.
So let me suggest for next time, Trip, also make an announcement to our listeners.
Yeah.
I think I'll probably do a shorter lecture in the beginning, and then we'll have more time for the conversation. And let's hope that people send you some questions. So we'll also try to answer some of the questions. There were some questions in the chat today. People can put them on the Facebook. everywhere, and I really would love to hear what they are and get there to them.
Yeah, and the if they're posted, I add them to the thing. But if you haven't sent them, you should send them. Next week we're talking about the Bible, because if you're down for the class struggle in religion, then it's probably because you read the Bible. And even when Jorg and I were talking about this class, the I kind of was like, we have to do the Bible section, and I was like, we could just talk about Exodus. And then I sent him a rather lengthy document of all of like, he's like, well, what would you talk about? And I was like, here's what I would do, but that's because I'm a Baptist minister, and I realized that if you're going to talk about most things, it has more pop if you locate it in a narrative. And then once you go looking for it and you discover Exodus, you realize it'll make everyone uncomfortable because God takes sides in an aggressive way. So,
or the Bible tells us so. Yeah, we'll talk about it next time. I look forward to it, Trip.
Oh, it's gonna be fun.
Thanks. Yeah.
So thank you all for joining and hanging out. And you can reply to any of the emails with questions and such, and I'll add them to the list. But this has been a fun first session, and look forward to the continued journey. And those of you that are obviously listening or watching later, you can reply to emails as well, because just because you can't get free at the same time doesn't mean your voice doesn't get to shape things, which is good, because I understand that. I plan all classes after I get done homeschooling 3 kids in Scotland. That's why it's currently, 11 o'clock for me. So we don't need to give preferential option for the live streamers. So send your questions.